I do love my job. I always tell people that I fall in love regularly every week with people, ideas, and projects. And my advice to everybody who I come across, particularly young people, is to look at your week and at the end of the week, really think, have you had that sense of awesomeness and inspiration? And did you fall in love with anything or anybody in the last week? And you haven't, you really have to think about doing something else. So, and I'm a huge admirer of BSR and the work that BSR does, and of Aaron and staff, and we've been collaborators and colleagues for a while now, so it's a huge privilege to be here with you. As futurists, actually, this is a little secret. We always start by looking at the past. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history when we think about networks. And this is a bit of history going back to 1964. This is a graphic from a paper that Paul Bairn, who was one of the co-founders of the Institute for the Future and developer of something called packet switching technologies, which is a foundational technology for the internet. So Paul, in 1964, while working at RAND, published this paper in which he envisioned a new kind of communication system, moving from centralized networks to distributed emergent networks. And what's interesting about that, so think about it, I don't know how many people were alive in 1960s, but for those of you who were and others who may know, this was at the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So what Paul and others were working on, the dilemma was, how do we deal with the threat of nuclear attack? What happens after the nuclear attack, and how do we maintain our communication system for post-attack coordination? Because our systems look like those centralized, that picture on your left, highly centralized. So obviously, it's easy to disrupt that kind of system, right? All you have to do is target a few central nodes, and basically the whole system is down. So not very resilient. So Paul and others suggested moving to a new kind of system that's highly distributed, emergent, where large chunks of data are broken down into small pieces, into packets, and they can travel along multiple nodes. So if any node is taken out, there are alternative pathways. And this data is reassembled at the end. So this is really what the internet is. And at the time, they were working on something called the ARPANET. This is a foundation of a new kind of distributed communications infrastructure that we've built over the last 40 years. And there are several characteristics of this that are important, which is large chunks of data are broken down into smaller pieces, into packets. That data travels along multiple paths, so it's very hard to bring it down. It's very resilient, and it's emergent. You can't predict which path it's going to take, and it's ultimately reassembled into something bigger at some point at the end. But the interesting thing about that it's not just about our technology. And as many social scientists and those who study technology and innovation know, that when we change our basic communications, our basic fundamental technology infrastructure, we're not just changing our technology, we're really changing our society. We're changing everything that we're doing, and we're sort of feeling it. We're in the midst of that. This is what Clay Shirky talked about in his book. Marshall McLuhan famously said, we invent our technologies, and thereafter our technologies reinvent us. And I think we're kind of in the early stages of this reinvention of everything we're doing. From the centralized, in many ways, our social or economic infrastructure is beginning to resemble that network, that highly distributed communications infrastructure that we've built. And at the Institute, when we think about this, and we think about it a lot as we apply it to ourselves and to the people and organizations that we work with, we think of it as kind of a two-curve framework, which is that in any period of large fundamental transformations, we kind of link along two paths, along two curves. One curve is the incumbent curve. We have institutions, we have organizations, we have regulations. We've been on this path. We know how it works. It's been around for a while. But we see that this way of doing things is kind of on the decline. It doesn't mean that everybody will be out, but it's kind of, that's dominant form, it's declining. At the same time, we see emergence of what we call a nascent curve, a new way of doing things, a new way of creating value. And at this point, we're only seeing sort of signals of how that curve might evolve. We don't know the final destination yet. So when I think about these two curves, to me, the incumbent curve is what I call the curve of institutional production, where everything was done through large centralized institutions. Think of it as those centralized networks from Paul Barron's article. And the new curve is what I call the curve of social-structed creation. I use that word in my book, and my editor hated the word. And I know people have trouble pronouncing it, and she basically forbade me for using this word. But luckily, she got laid off about 2 months before the book was published, so I managed to sneak it in. The new editor came in and all of that. But the reason I like that word, and the Institute is great at coining new words, I wanted to communicate two basic concepts here, is that we're creating something, we're constructing, we're creating something new, and we're doing it by using social ties and social technologies and social networks. So I define social structing as creating value by aggregating micro contributions by large networks using social tools and technologies. And I don't want to imply that all the institutions are going to disappear and you don't need to run and look for new jobs or figure out how to find your place in the, well, you need to find your place in the network world. But it doesn't mean that all the organizations are going to disappear. I do think that there's a lot of different kind of activities that's going to be happening on this new curve, and a lot of the old curve is going to be disrupted, but it doesn't mean that all the institutions are going to disappear. In fact, we're seeing emergence of new powerful institutions. I mean, if you think of Google, if you think even of Facebook, these are kind of the new pipelines, the new foundations of this economy, and they're getting bigger and bigger. Sometimes people are beginning to refer to them as oligopolies. So it's not that all of that is going to disappear, but there's kind of a reshuffling, big reshuffling going on. And there's an economic reason why this is taking place. Ron Coase was a Nobel Prize economist who just passed away about 6 months ago at the ripe age of 102. So he must have been doing something right to live that long. But in 1937, he published this really influential paper on the nature of the corporation, or you can read any organization, large centralized organization. And the basic question he posed is, why do we need organizations? Why do we need corporations in particular? And the answer was that why don't we just trade as individuals, which we've done for millennia through our human history. It's not that we were sitting around doing nothing, we managed to survive. So why do we need organizations? And the answer that he provided is that when you scale up production, when you need to produce more and more things, you need to manage a lot more assets. You need to manage more people. You need to manage new geographies. You need advertising. You need all of these things. So you have these transaction costs of managing to create that kind of scale. So to him, organizations are great at minimizing those transaction costs. What we need organizations for is to create scale while minimizing costs and increasing profits. So you can think of organizations as a kind of technology for creating scale and minimizing costs. And that's exactly what's being disrupted. This technology, which is organizations, is being disrupted because at their core, this infrastructure that we've created, it allows us this coordination of activities. It kind of lowers our transaction costs sometimes to zero. And that's the economic transformations that's underlining all of these things. And it starts with the media industry where we've seen what's been happening in newspaper and broadcast, where all of a sudden everybody is a broadcaster, everybody's creating content, everybody's getting platforms. But it's kind of rolling through our society, in our economy. And we're beginning to see it in so many other domains, virtually every domain of our lives. It's reshuffling, repositioning, this disruption. So I want to just talk briefly about 3 areas that I think is important where we see some of this disruption taking place: work, education, and governance. Let's start with work. So to me, these are sort of new models. If you see companies like Odesk, how many people are familiar with Odesk? How many? A lot of people, some people. Odesk now has 4 million people who are registered to complete tasks on Odesk. So basically, it's a platform that allows anybody who needs something done that can be done digitally over the networks to basically complete the task. So at the Institute, some of my researchers, unbeknownst to me, have been using people on Odesk to do research and to write papers. There's this famous story of a programmer who basically outsourced his job to people on Odesk, and he got all kinds of awards and patented things. And it turns out that he had nothing to do. I think he still deserves an award because he was very creative in how he did it. But there are 4 million people registered, and this platform has been growing tremendously. $1 billion were exchanged on Odesk just cumulatively in this year. So value is flowing to this network. People are managing to do things, to accomplish tasks without virtually any kind of organization. Similar things are beginning to happen in the physical domain, in the manufacturing. So this is a company called, this is David Lang, who actually has a product that he created, which is an underwater robot that senses and takes pictures of the ocean floor. And guess how this company started? He went to Tech Shop, where he prototyped the product. He had a community of people. Tech Shop is like a membership for manufacturing. You pay membership fees, and you can go there, and there are CNC machines and other kinds of laser printers and others. So it's like, instead of having your own manufacturing plant, you have it, you share it with many other people. So David went to Tech Shop. He prototyped this product. He went to Kickstarter. He got funding to actually produce the product. Not only he got funding, but he got people who are his customers right there. And then he used a flexible manufacturing network, some of it in China, some of it at the Tech Shop, to actually produce the product. So this is a company manufacturing something, producing something that really doesn't have its own manufacturing platform and uses this power of networks to create something. And another example, you're going to be engaged in a hackathon. Hackathon is virtually a must in Silicon Valley, and almost every day there is some hackathon or meetup happening. But this is a colleague of mine, Ariel Waldman, who regularly organizes what's called Science Hack Days. So she announces that for 48 hours, people will come together and work on science projects. And hundreds of people show up. We had one at the Institute where people showed up with sleeping bags. And actually, some of them stayed up for 48 hours. And at the end of that, they produced 15 different products, projects, prototypes. Not really simple. Some of them are funny and fun things, but some of them are very serious things, like converting particle accelerated data around the world into music, which you can see in all kinds of diagnostics and other kinds of applications. So not a trivial thing. But the interesting thing about what they've done and how they do it is that nobody told them what to do. Nobody paid them to do anything. They self-organized. Some people were credentialed scientists, some people were complete amateurs, some people only knew how to bring tea, and they participated on teams. And to me, they're showing new ways of working, these highly networked, sort of emergent ways of accomplishing pretty amazing things. So to me, what social structured work is about these amplified individuals, individuals amplified with the power of social networks and their connectivity to accomplish the kind of things that previously nobody could do or only large organization could do. So this is where I see some interesting signals of what's happening in work. The other area that is undergoing a huge disruption, I do a lot of work with educational organizations, particularly universities and colleges, and it's interesting what's happening in that domain. So this is probably a very familiar scene, right? You're out there in the world somewhere with a group of friends, you have a question, or you want to know who wrote this book. Everybody pops out their devices, and you go to Wikipedia or to Google and you quickly find an answer to whatever you were looking for. And I don't think it's a trivial moment. I think this is a micro-learning moment. It's a moment where people are together, they're in a social setting, they're motivated to learn something, and they have the resources and access to resources to find out what they're interested in. And I bet you they're going to remember it a lot more than if they were sitting in the classroom. So basically, we're now moving into the world where this kind of data, Wikipedia and other things, is moving off the desktops into the physical world, into our environment. Just an example of that, this is a project by USC and UCLA called Hypercities, where you can take your mobile device and you can walk around a city and you can point to a building and it will show you the history of the building. It will show you maybe pictures of what that area looked like 100 years ago, or who lived there, the demographics of the place, or post pictures and videos of more recent transformations. So you can imagine the history lesson not sitting in the classroom, but a history lesson where you're actually in context, in the actual physical setting. I mean, if you think about it, the classrooms are extremely sensory poor environments. And so we basically have kids and adults sitting in these environments and forcing them to learn something when the whole world all of a sudden becomes a learning environment, a learning space. And if you're not interested in history, if you're interested in botany, you can download an app like this, which is called Snapchat. I mean, Snapleaf. Snapchat is a whole different thing, which you can also do. But Snapleaf, what it allows you to do is take a picture of a leaf or a plant, and it will give you all this information about the genus of that tree that it's a part of, and where it grows, and how it grows, and all this other information. Similar, imagine that same lesson happening in the classroom where you have to learn these kinds of things. So the amazing transformation is that the whole world becomes a classroom. We have the possibility of turning the whole world into a truly learning and educational experience. And you know, there's been all these conversations about MOOCs, massively open online courses. People think that they're going to make money on them, and some people might. But what we see is that there's a whole content is becoming a commodity, basically. There's so much content that's being produced between MOOCs and Coursera's and hundreds of other platforms, and everybody's producing videos online, and there's Wikipedia and Google and all these other resources. So content is a commodity, but what's interesting was content becoming widely available and distributed anywhere in the physical world. We're really moving into the world of where learning is not constrained by time and place. It's not about sitting in the classroom for 45 minutes or an hour, but learning can be anytime, any place. And so we're beginning to see this generation of what we call extreme learners. These are people who are interested, they're motivated, and they can learn everything, almost everything, on their own or in their social group. I think the social group and the social motivation is really important. But the resources are out there. So to me, social structured learning is we're moving from an environment in which learning was confined to place and institution to kind of learning being a flow. So think of it as a river of content that's out there, or a field of content. And if you want something, you want to dip in and out of it. All you have to do is dip. And what we really need to have conversations about is not the content that's being created. That's going to be there. But what is it that motivates people to become these continuous learners? What kind of systems and environments that we need to build that everybody will want to be an extreme learner? That learning is just embedded into your daily life and daily activities. And to me, one of the most exciting things that's happening in the whole education sphere with MOOCs and other things is that for the first time in probably many decades, we're having a conversation about pedagogy. What does it mean? What is the best methodology? What's the best pedagogy for learning in this kind of new environment? So that's education. And last thing I want to talk about is about governance. Because particularly in your area and the kind of interests you represent, you probably know that our governance systems are broken. I mean, this is why we're having all the issues with climate discussions. You can just see what's been happening in the US Congress just recently. And basically, our governance systems haven't changed. Our governance systems are not really suited for this networked world, for this network environment. And unfortunately, we can't solve many of our problems of today without fixing our basic governance systems. And I am optimistic that change is possible and that we can transform our governance to this kind of networked world. And this is what I think there are 4 areas where I see some interesting signals and possibilities for how this might happen. And one is that a lot of data is moving into the open domain. A lot of data is now being created and being aggregated by individuals, by people. It's simple things like watches that people, or these mobile devices where people can monitor environmental, they can monitor contamination of air, they can monitor their environment in which they live. We're all carrying these sensing devices on us in multiple ways. This is just an example. This is a watch that was used in Paris where people were monitoring contaminants level in the air, and turns out that they were getting better data than some of the government data that was there. So data, and data in multiple formats. Now people are documenting human rights abuses. There's videos, there's very rich media that's being produced. So a lot of data is basically moving from institutions to individuals. The other area is that we are creating some really interesting, what I call decision support system, simulation models and others. And they're not perfect. Every model is based on a certain degree of assumptions, but our models are getting better as we're getting more data into them. And they may be simple things like this little program that was used by BBS, where you can actually play with a government federal budget and you can make some assumptions. Not a bad exercise. Speaking of education, I think that's really educational for kids. What's best way to learn math is to figure out the federal budget, right? And the intricacies. I don't know if you can entice people to do that, but I think there are ways to do that. This is a game, and games and gamification is, of course, a big area for enticing people to do these kinds of things and for learning. So this is a simple app, but there are other programs and simulation models. This particular one comes from a researcher at Park, and what this model does, it allows you to put in data on basically different characteristics of your environment, where you live, your zip code, and other things, and it can give you models of what's the best energy package that you should be using. How do you, so people can do it on an individual basis. And we have lots of these different decision support systems, and we're going to be creating more and more of those to help people make better decisions and hopefully make communities make better decisions. The third area that I think is interesting and gives me some hope is that we're creating all kinds of engagement platforms where people can express opinions, they can debate each other, they can have conversations, meaningful conversations, not just, comment flows that you see in a lot of blogs and others, but really meaningful conversation. We have these platforms for deliberation. Ken Goldberg, who is a professor at Berkeley, says that we're moving from the world of information to the world of opinions, and everybody can participate in this opinion making. Just one example of that is something that we use at the Institute. We call it the Foresight Engine, which is a platform for people to envision their future and then have conversations about possibilities. This was used, this program, Magnetic South, we did with a community, Christchurch in New Zealand, after an earthquake, where they used it to deliberate what they should do after the earthquake to basically help rebuild their community. We're doing very similar things with many different organizations. And it's amazing the kind of conversation threads and the kind of ideas you can get, and you can sense the pulse of these communities. You can sense what's going on and what's the direction that they need to be moving in. And finally, we have possibilities of this micro-participation, people directly engaging in some of the provision of some of the services in their communities, in their cities, in many other areas. One example of that I particularly like comes from San Ramon, where the fire department basically developed this app that if people downloaded on their cell phone, if you know CPR, you will be notified if somebody in the immediate vicinity, literally a few feet away from you, is having a heart attack. So people can immediately turn into good Samaritans, which a lot of people want to be, and they can provide help. And when they did, by the way, this app was developed by their summer intern, not by their IT department. But interesting things happened in that community. First of all, the rate of survival after heart attacks has really gone up. And the second thing is that the rate of they had to offer more CPR classes because so many people wanted to participate. People want to participate in the affairs of their communities. They're interested, they're willing to be these good Samaritans. And if you can provide avenues for doing that, I think we'll have much more engagement in our communities. So I do think that a lot of these experiments we're seeing at the local level, at the city level, with budgeting systems, with deliberation platforms. San Francisco is doing some amazing things with data and engaging communities in this data and decision-making. New York and other places, I think it's starting at the local level and it's starting at the city level, but I think it's going to increase. So those are kind of three particular domains that I see that are being reshaped and that are being disrupted. And again, I want to go back to that notion that I don't think that all the organizations are going to disappear. I do think that every organization at this point has to be asking itself a question. So if you were starting whatever you're doing today, and with today's set of technologies, with today's set of infrastructure, how would you design it? How would you design whatever you're doing for that second curve? Because we know how to do the first curve, but the challenge and the issue for us is how would you do it for the second curve? And look at your projects and think about, is that the second curve project? Or can I stay on the first curve? Can I stay on that curve forever? And maybe I can be very successful there. But that's kind of the conversation that I think we need to be having in every domain of our lives. You know, we are doing it with educational institutions, with our governance system, and we need to be having it in our organizations. Thank you.